Hare Krishna devotees, welcome to day 77 of our Bhakti Vaibhava seminar on Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 4. We are in the 28th chapter, titled Puranjan Becomes a Woman in the Next Life. And today we're going to continue on from verse 31. Which the situation is that Puranjan has taken birth as a woman in his next life, or her next life, as Vaidarbhi, the daughter of King Vidarbha, and she has become married to a powerful king named Malaya Dwaja, and they have had many children. Yes, but first of all, let us chant our prayers. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Pastya Chadejatarane Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivas Adi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchkalpatarubhyascha kripas sindubhya evacha, patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. We are in the 6th section, verse 29 to 32, section titled Malaya Dwaja Marries Vaidarbhi. And as I said, we have reached 31, verse 31. So verse 31, my dear King Prachanabarhishat, the sons of Malaya Dwaja gave birth to many thousands and thousands of sons. And all of these have been protecting the entire world up to the end of one Manu's lifespan, and even afterward. I may have said that Malaya Dwaja and Vaidarbhi gave birth to thousands of sons. No, that's not correct. One daughter with blackish eyes, and 7 sons who ruled the South Indian area, Dravida area. So, but those sons of Vaidarbhi and Malaya Dwaja, they gave birth to many thousands and thousands of sons. Right, so let's have a look at Srila Prabhupada's purport. Prabhupada gives some information which we've heard many times before in this seminar, that in a day of Brahma there are 14 Manus. And the lifespan of one Manu is 71 times 4,320,000 years. After one Manu passes away, another Manu begins his lifespan. And in this way, the life cycle of the universe is going on. So, as one follows another, one Manu follows another, Krishna consciousness is imparted, as Lord Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita chapter 4 verse 1. A famous verse, Imam Vivasvate Yogam Proktavan Aham Avyayam Vivasvan Manave Praha Manur Ikshvakave Bravit. I instructed this imperishable science of yoga to the sun god Vivasvan, and Vivasvan instructed it to Manu, the father of mankind, and Manu in turn instructed it to Ikshvaku. So, Prabhupada brings up one point. No one should think Krishna consciousness is a new movement. Oh, Krishna, it's so ancient. Its propagation has never stopped. So both Srimad Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita, they both confirm it's very old. It's passed down from one Manu to another, and like this. So anyway, on to the second paragraph. Prabhupada raises the point. Sometimes amongst Vaishnavas there may be difference of opinion for different reasons, one's personal nature, but still Krishna consciousness must go on. And Prabhupada gives the example of that under Srila Bhaktivinoda's instruction, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was preaching in an organized way. And then the disciples of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, they're godbrothers, Prabhupada's one of them, of course, and there's some differences of opinion amongst them. And on that basis, they're not really working together like a real team. Prabhupada says, we're not acting conjointly, but every one of us is spreading Krishna consciousness according to his capacity, and some disciples are coming, and disciples are going around the world. This is now when Prabhupada talks about this, he's talking about ISKCON, because his godbrothers, their disciples particularly at that point, they were definitely not spreading all over the world, but Prabhupada definitely was. So like this, Prabhupada says, ISKCON is spreading like wildfire. Like wildfire. Yes. And Prabhupada says that it's this Krishna consciousness, based on the 9 principles. We were just talking about 7 of the 9, but actually based on all 9. Prabhupada says it'll never be stopped. No one can check it. So we should have faith, we must have faith in these words of Prabhupada, because sometimes devotees, because there are challenges, there are definitely challenges from time to time. And sometimes devotees become very disappointed and think that, the movement is going to sort of disintegrate. But anyway, let's just carry on and have faith. It will go on, Prabhupada says, without distinction of caste, creed, color, or country. No one can check it. And then there's the 3rd paragraph. Prabhupada says the word bokshyate is very important here. That just as a king gives protection to the citizens, the devotees, Prabhupada says, these devotees, Bhaktivinoda Thakur is there, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta is there, Srila Prabhupada is there, and the sincere followers of Srila Prabhupada are there. So these devotees, following the principles of devotional service, will give protection to everyone in the world, because the people are harassed. Prabhupada says they're harassed by so-called swamis, yogis, karmis, jnanis, but none of them can show the right way. Yeah. Prabhupada mentions that there are the 4 sampradayas, and we are in the Madhva Gaudiya Sampradaya coming from Lord Chaitanya. Yeah. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, all these devotees are spreading this Krishna consciousness movement very widely and giving protection to innocent people who are being so much embarrassed by pseudo-avatars, pseudo-swamis, pseudo-yogis, and others. Verse 32, the great sage named Agastya married the firstborn daughter of Malaya Dwaja, the avowed devotee of Lord Krishna. From her one son was born whose name was Dridachyuta, and from him another son was born whose name was Idmavaha. Right. So let's have a look at the purport. Prabhupada says the name Agastya Muni is significant. He represents the mind. The word Agastya, Prabhupada says, indicates the senses don't act independently. And the word Muni means mind. The mind is the center of the senses. And so the senses can't work independently from the mind. And when the mind takes up to Krishna consciousness, takes to bhakti, then the mind engages in devotional service. So Prabhupada makes the point that the cult of bhakti, the Bhakti Lata, is the first daughter of Malaya Dwaja and Vaibhava. And her blackish eyes are always upon Krishna. Yeah. Prabhupada makes a very important point, which he doesn't really address so often. He does address sometimes, though. And that is that you cannot render bhakti to a demigod, only to Lord Vishnu, only to Vishnu Tattva, shall we say, Krishna, Vishnu, and their expansions, etc. Otherwise, demigods, their business is giving material benedictions. And that's basically all they do. That's basically all they do. Is that people worship them for material things, depending on which demigod it is, and they give whatever the thing is. Yeah. So that the worship of the person who's approaching the particular demigod, that is not bhakti. It's the desire for sense gratification. So anyway, Prabhupada goes on that the Mayavadis think the absolute truth is formless, and they say that the word bhakti can apply to any form of worship. But that is not correct, is not true. So if that were the case, a devotee could imagine any demigod or any sort of godly type form and worship it, but this is not the real fact. The real fact is that bhakti, devotion, particularly advanced bhakti, selfless devotion with no selfish desire at all, that can only be offered to Lord Vishnu, to Lord Krishna and their expansions. So therefore, Bhakti Lata is Dridha Vrata, a great vow. For when the mind is completely engaged in devotional service, the mind doesn't fall down. Yeah. If you try to advance by any other means, you'll fall down. But if you're fixed in bhakti, you'll never fall down. So therefore, the point is, from Bhakti Lata, which is the first, who is the first daughter of Malaya Dwaja and Vaibhava. So from Bhakti Lata, the son Dridachyuta was born, and from him the next son, Idmavaha, was born. Idmavaha refers to one who carries wood for sacrifice when approaching a spiritual master. So the point is, Prabhupada says, that Bhakti Lata, the cult of devotion, fixes one in one's spiritual position so much that one never falls down. And then one can beget children, her strict followers of Shastra. Right. The Vedas say it is, Mundaka Upanishad, Tad Vigyanartam Sagarum Evabikach Chet, Sumitpani Shrotriam Brahmanishtam. That one should approach the spiritual master carrying wood to be used in sacrifice. So therefore Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, in the line of devotional service, those who are initiated are strict followers of the Vedic scriptural injunctions. Right. Okay, so on we go, devotees, to the next section. It's a longer section, a little bit longer. Verse 33 to verse 44, Malaya Dwaja leaves home. Right. In his old age, as is the practice, and we saw with, we saw with the other great devotees who we've come across in this canto. They all left home. They all left home. Yeah. Prior to that, in the first canto, Dhritarashtra left home, and so on like that. Maharaj Prithu left home, and yes, and so on. So, okay, so let's read the verses 33 to 44. After this, the great saintly king Malaya Dwaja divided his entire kingdom among his sons. Then, in order to worship Lord Krishna with full attention, he went to a solitary place known as Kulachala. 34. Just as the moonshine follows the moon at night, immediately after King Malaya Dwaja departed for Kulachala, whose devoted wife, whose eyes were very enchanting, followed him, giving up all homely happiness despite family and children. Verses 35 and 36. In the province of Kulachala, there were rivers named Chandravasa, Tamraparni, and Vatadaka. King Malaya Dwaja used to go to those pious rivers regularly and take his bath there. Thus he purified himself externally and internally. He took his bath and ate bulbs, seeds, leaves, flowers, roots, fruits, and grasses, and drank water. In this way he underwent severe austerities. Eventually, he became very skinny. Verse 37, through austerity, King Malaya Dwaja in body and mind gradually became equal to the dualities of cold and heat, happiness and distress, wind and rain, hunger and thirst, the pleasant and the unpleasant. In this way he conquered all relativities. Verse 38. By worshipping, executing austerities, and following the regulative principles, King Malaya Dwaja conquered his senses, his life, and his consciousness. Thus he fixed everything on the central point of the Supreme Brahman, Krishna. Verse 39. In this way he stayed immovable in one place for 100 years by the calculations of the demigods. After this time he developed pure devotional attraction for Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and remained fixed in that position. Verse 40. King Malaya Dwaja attained perfect knowledge by being able to distinguish the supersoul from the individual soul. The individual soul is localized, whereas the supersoul is all-pervasive. He became perfect in knowledge that the material body is not the soul, but that the soul is the witness of the material body. Verse 41. In this way, King Malaya Dwaja attained perfect knowledge, because in his pure state he was directly instructed by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. By means of such enlightening transcendental knowledge, he could understand everything from all angles of vision. 42. King Malaya Dwaja could thus observe that the super soul was sitting by his side, and that he, as the individual soul, was sitting by the side of the super soul. Since both were together, there was no need for separate interests. Thus, he ceased from such activities. 43. The daughter of King Vaibhava accepted her husband all in all as the supreme. She gave up all sensual enjoyment and in complete renunciation followed the principles of her husband, who was so advanced. Thus she remained engaged in his service. 44. The daughter of King Vidarbha wore old garments, and she was lean and thin because of her vows of austerity. Since she did not arrange her hair, it became entangled and twisted in locks. Although she remained always near her husband, she was as silent and unagitated as the flame of an undisturbed fire. Okay, right. So there you go, devotees. That's that section. So let's go back and go through in detail. So it's the 7th section, verse 33 to verse 44, and it's called Malaya Dwaja Leaves Home. Right, so verse 33, after this the great saintly King Malaya Dwaja divided his entire kingdom among his sons. Then, in order to worship Lord Krishna with full attention, he went to a solitary place known as Kulachala. Right, so Srila Prabhupada makes the point that Malaya Dwaja is a very great devotee. He's actually a Mahabhagavat, certainly a Mahabhagavat, topmost devotee. And by his devotional service, he begot many sons and disciples for spreading the Bhakti cult. And Prabhupada makes the point that actually the entire world should be divided among such disciples. When those disciples grow up and they're able to preach, the spiritual master should retire to write and do nirjana bhajan, sitting silently in a solitary place and doing devotional service. This is not possible for neophytes. We should not try. Srila Bhakti Siddhanta never advised neophytes to do that. And he actually has written a song about it. Not so well known, but it is a bit known. And this is a little bit from it. Dushtamana tumi kishera Vaishnava pratishtara tare nirjanira gare tava harinama kevala kaitav. My dear mind, what kind of devotee are you? Simply for cheap adoration you sit in a solitary place and pretend to chant the Hare Krishna Mahamantra, but this is all cheating. So therefore, Prabhupada points out that in this way, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta advocated that every devotee under the guidance of the spiritual master should preach Krishna consciousness all over the world. And only when he's mature enough can he sit in a solitary place and retire from preaching. So therefore, following this example, we as devotees of ISKCON, we serve as preachers all over the world. That's what we do. And so Prabhupada, of course, Prabhupada's talking about his time. Now his disciples, at the time of his writing, Prabhupada's saying, now his disciples can allow the spiritual master, that's Prabhupada, can allow Prabhupada to retire from active preaching. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, in the last stage of the spiritual master's life, the devotees of the spiritual master should take preaching activities into their own hands. In this way, the spiritual master can sit down in a solitary place and render nirjana bhajan. Verse 34, just as the moonshine follows the moon at night, immediately after King Malayadwaja departed for Kulachala, his devoted wife, whose eyes were very enchanting, followed him, giving up all homely happiness despite family and children. This is Puranjan. Was Puranjan, now Vaidarbhi. Right, so Srila Prabhupada explains that just as in the Vanaprastha stage, the wife follows the husband, so similarly when the spiritual master retires for Nirjana Bhajan, some advanced disciples follow him and serve him personally and help him, with like washing clothes, cooking, providing basic necessities, so he can just focus on his bhajan. So Prabhupada says, in other words, those who are very fond of family life should come forward in service to the spiritual master and give up so-called happiness of society, friendship, and love. Prabhupada quotes Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, last verse of Govastakam, at least last one, as we sing it. Yasya prasada bhagavat prasada. Disciples should always remember that by serving the spiritual master, he can advance in Krishna consciousness. The disciple can. All the scriptures recommend that it's by pleasing the spiritual master and serving him directly that one can attain the highest perfectional stage of devotional service. Right, so second paragraph, Prabhupada makes the point that the word madhirakshana is also significant in this verse. And Prabhupada points out that Srila Jiva Goswami in his Sandarbha has explained that the word madhira means intoxicating. So if one's eyes become intoxicated upon seeing the deity, he may be called madhirakshana. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, Queen Vaidarbhi's eyes were very enchanting, just as one's eyes are madhirakshana when engaged in seeing the temple deity. Unless one is an advanced devotee, he cannot fix his eyes on the deity in the temple. So on we go with verses 35 and 36. In the province of Kulachala, there were rivers named Chandravasa, Tamraparni, and Vatodaka. King Malayadwaja used to go to those pious rivers regularly and take his bath there. Thus he purified himself externally and internally. He took his bath and ate bulbs, seeds, leaves, flowers, roots, fruits, and grasses, and drank water. In this way he underwent severe austerities. Eventually he became very skinny. So Srila Prabhupada comments that we can definitely see that to advance in Krishna consciousness, we have to control our weight. If you become too fat, it's to be assumed you're not advancing spiritually. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta would severely criticize his fat disciples. So we mustn't eat too much. So previously they go to the forest but such austerities and penances are not really practical now. Now what we must do, we should only eat prasadam and no more than required. And we should observe the many fast days, Ekadasis, the appearance days of the Lord, the great devotees. Yeah, and they are to help us to decrease the fat in the body so no one will sleep too much. Because this human life is for austerity, which means controlling sex, food intake, etc. So time can be saved for spiritual activity. So then both the body and mind can be cleansed. Verse 37. Through austerity, King Malayadwaja, in body and mind, gradually became equal to the dualities of cold and heat, happiness and distress, wind and rain, hunger and thirst, the pleasant and the unpleasant. In this way he conquered all relativities. So Srila Prabhupada gives a fairly substantial purport here. Prabhupada, first thing he says, liberation means become free from the relativities of this world. Unless you're self-realized, you have to deal with these dualities, struggling, too hot, too cold, like this. So in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna tells us we have to develop tolerance, winter and summer seasons. In the winter, it's cold. We may not want to take a cold bath. In the summer, it can be very hot, particularly in India, it can be extremely hot. And you may want to take a bath 2 or 3 times a day or more. So Krishna says, don't be disturbed by these relativities. And let me just tell you a little story that appeared in Back to Godhead many years ago. There was a wise man, and he had a horse, and he had a son, and he had some friends, but the friends were foolish. He had some foolish friends. So he had his horse, but one day the horse just escaped and was gone. And the foolish friends came by and said, oh, but the horse has gone away. That's very bad. And the wise man said, well, it may be bad, it may be good. It's a duality, you see, good or bad. So it may be bad, it may be good. For those foolish friends, it was bad. The next day, the horse came back of his own accord. And not only that, he brought another horse with him, a friend. So now the wise man has 2 horses. And the foolish friends came and said, oh, that's good. And the wise man said, it may be good, it may be bad. So you see, the dualities, it's very interesting. The next day, the son of the wise man tried to ride on the new horse because it was a wild horse. And he wanted to ride on the horse and tame the horse so they could use the horse. So he jumped on the back of the horse, but the horse had never experienced this. And so he just went wild and jumping around and threw the son off, and the son broke his leg. And the foolish friends came by, and what did they say? They said, oh, that's bad. And the wise man, what did he say? It may be bad, it may be good. The next day, the local king declared war on some neighboring country, and he sent his soldiers around to gather up all the strong young men to fight in the war and possibly get killed. So they came to the wise man's house, and they saw the wise man's son, and the wise man's son, he's broken his leg. So he's just lying there. And they thought, a lazy young man, let's grab him and take him and just put him in the army to fight in the war. But then they saw that the son had broken his leg. He couldn't even stand up. So they left him. And the foolish friends came and they said, "Oh, that's very good." And the wise man said, "It may be good, it may be bad." And that was sort of the end of the story. But relativities, we have to learn to tolerate them. Tams titikshasva bharata, Krishna tells Arjuna. We have to tolerate the dualities. A second paragraph. So the common man has to undergo much austerity so he can become equipoised in the face of these different dualities. Anyone who becomes agitated by them is in a relative position and has to undergo austerity in order to be able to do that, to transcend the body. So Malaya Dwaja, he underwent severe austerities. First of all, he left his home and went to Kulachala. Then he was taking his bath in the sacred rivers. He was eating only vegetables, things like stems, roots, seeds, flowers, leaves. He was avoiding any cooked food or grains. And Prabhupada makes the point that this is all very austere, extremely austere. And in this age, it's very difficult to leave home and go to the forest or the Himalayas for austerities. And even in many cases, if someone is asked to give up meat, give up drinking, gambling, illicit sex, they won't be able to do that. So what would such a person do if they went to the Himalayas? So it's not really possible now. And therefore Lord Krishna, he advises us just to practice Bhakti Yoga, that's all. It'll deliver us, it'll liberate us from dualities. So we just put Krishna in the center. He's always transcendental. And we must then engage in devotional service to transcend dualities. This is confirmed by Krishna in Bhagavad Gita 14:26. I won't read the Sanskrit, but the translation, famous verse, one who engages in full devotional service, who does not fall down in any circumstance, at once transcends the modes of material nature and thus comes to the level of Brahman. So on we go to the third paragraph. If you're actually engaged in devotional service, then you'll automatically control your senses, your tongue, etc. Yeah. So, and once you're sincerely engaged in devotional service in Bhakti Yoga, there's no chance of falling down. And even if somehow one does, there's no loss. Prabhupada addresses this point, concluding the purport. He says, one's devotional activities may be stunned or choked for the time being, but as soon as there is another chance, the practitioner begins from the point where he left off. Right, devotees, on we go to verse 38. By worshipping, executing austerities, and following the regulative principles, King Malaya Dwaja conquered his senses, his life, and his consciousness. Thus he fixed everything on the central point of the Supreme Brahman. Okay. Right, the Supreme Brahman, Krishna. So Prabhupada, in his purport, says, whenever they see the word Brahman, the impersonalists take it to mean the impersonal Brahma Jyoti. But actually, the Supreme Brahman, Para Brahman, is Krishna, Vasudeva. Prabhupada refers to Bhagavad Gita 7:19, in which Krishna says he is everything, Vasudeva Sarvam iti. Yeah, so you cannot fix your mind just on something impersonal, like the sky. You cannot just look at the sky. Yeah. So, but you can fix your mind on a person, Krishna. But fixing your mind just on something impersonal, Prabhupada refers to Bhagavad Gita chapter 12, verse 5. It's actually a very important verse. Kleshadi kataraste shama vyakta sakta chetasam. For those whose minds are attached to the unmanifested, impersonal feature of the Supreme, advancement is very troublesome. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, consequently, when it's said herein that King Malayadwaja fixed his mind on Brahman, so Brahman means in the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vasudeva. Verse 39, in this way he stayed immovable in one place for 100 years by the calculations of the demigods. After this time he developed pure devotional attraction for Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and remained fixed in that position. So, Srila Prabhupada quotes the same Bhagavad Gita 7:19, which was just quoted in the previous purport. Bahunam janmanam ante jnanavan mam prapajyate vasudeva sarvamiti samahatma sudurlabhaha, which means, after many births and deaths, he who is actually in knowledge surrenders unto me, knowing me to be the cause of all causes and all that is. Such a great soul is very rare. Right, so Bhagavad Gita says that it takes many births to realize this. And this is confirmed in this verse. He did his program for 100 years of the demigods. And according to the calculations of the demigods, one day, meaning 12, the daylight hours, one day, is equal to 6 months on earth. So 100 years of the demigods would equal 36,000 earth years. So he did austerities and penances for 36,000 of our years. And then he became fixed in devotional service. So generally, of course, by our standards, to live for so many years, you'd have to take birth many times. Yes. Of course, this is, not in Kali Yuga. So this confirms, Prabhupada says, the conclusion of Krishna. To come to Krishna's conclusion and remain fixed in the realization that Krishna is everything. The conclusion of Krishna is what's stated there in Bhagavad Gita chapter 7, verse 19. So to come to that conclusion and remain fixed in the realization that Krishna is everything, plus to render service to Krishna, these are characteristics of the perfectional stage. Prabhupada refers to Chaitanya Charitamrita Madhya Lila, chapter 2, verse 62, which actually it's giving a definition of Shraddha or faith. But anyway, this is the second line of the verse. Krishna Bhakti Kaile Sarva Karma Krita Hoy. When you come to the conclusion that Krishna is everything, by serving him, by doing devotional service, then you become perfect in all respects. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, not only must one come to the conclusion that Krishna is everything, but he must remain fixed in this realization. This is the highest perfection of life, and it is this perfection that King Malaya Dwaja attained at the end. Verse 40, King Malaya Dwaja attained perfect knowledge by being able to distinguish the supersoul from the individual soul. The individual soul is localized, whereas the supersoul is all-pervasive. He became perfect in knowledge that the material body is not the soul, but that the soul is the witness of the material body. Right, so we have a look at Srila Prabhupada's purport here. Prabhupada points out that the conditioned soul is often frustrated, trying to understand the distinctions between the material body, super soul, individual soul. Yeah. Prabhupada makes the point there are two types of Mayavadis. This is very interesting. Two types of Mayavadis, the Buddhists and the followers of Shankaracharya. Yeah. The Buddhists don't recognize that there's anything beyond the body, or even that the body doesn't exist. Yeah. But the followers of Shankara conclude that there's no separate existence of the super soul. Okay. So the Shankaracharya people, they believe the individual soul is identical with the super soul, of course. Yeah. But the Vaishnava philosopher, who's perfect in knowledge, knows that the body is external energy, and that the super soul, who's the Supreme Lord, is sitting with the individual soul and is distinct from the individual soul. Yes. So, therefore, Lord Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita 13:3, I'll just read the translation, O scion of Bharata, you should understand that I am also the knower in all bodies, and to understand this body and its owner is called knowledge. That is my opinion. Second paragraph. So the body is the field and the soul is the worker in the field. But there's another one there who knows the field, and that's the super soul. But the super soul, who's there along with the individual soul, but he's just witnessing, that's all. He doesn't get into pursuing the fruits of activities. So Prabhupada explains that distinction, something we've come across many times. The individual soul works and enjoys the fruits of the body, or tries to. But whereas the super soul simply witnesses the activities of the soul, but does not enjoy the fruits of those activities. And the super soul is present in every field of activity, means in every body, because each body is a field of activity for particularly the particular individual soul who is inhabiting that body, but then also super soul is there as well. So the super soul, Prabhupada explains, is present in every field of activity, whereas the individual soul is present in his one localized body. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, King Malaya Dwaja attained this perfection of knowledge and was able to distinguish between the soul and the supersoul, and the soul and the material body. Verse 41. In this way, King Malayadwaja attained perfect knowledge, because in his pure state he was directly instructed by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. By means of such enlightening transcendental knowledge, he could understand everything from all angles of vision. Okay, let's look at Prabhupada's purport here. Prabhupada makes the point that the words Sakshad Bhagavatot Kena Guruna Harina are very significant. Well, the Lord speaks directly to the soul when the devotee is completely purified by devotional service. Krishna confirms this in Bhagavad Gita chapter 10, Tesham Sadati Yuktanam, Bhajatam Pritipurvakam, Dadami Buddhi Yogam Tam, Yena Mamupayanti Te. Famous verse, to those who are constantly devoted and worship me with love, I give the understanding by which they can come to me. Second paragraph, the Lord is the Supersoul, and he acts as Chaita Guru, the spiritual master within. But he gives direct instructions only to the advanced devotees, the pure devotees. In the beginning, he gives instructions to approach a bona fide spiritual master. And then when one is trained by the spiritual master, according to the regulative principles of devotional service, and is situated on the platform of spontaneous attachment for the Lord, Raga Bhakti, then the Lord gives instructions from within to the devotee who was neophyte but now has become advanced. Tesham Satata Yuktanam Bhajatam Pritipurvakam, second time in one purport, Prabhupada refers to that. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying that having attained this stage, King Malayadwaja was directly in touch with the Supreme Lord and was receiving instructions from him directly. Verse 42. King Malayadwaja could thus observe that the super soul was sitting by his side, and that he, as the individual soul, was sitting by the side of the super soul. Since both were together, there was no need for separate interest. Thus, he ceased from such activities. So the first paragraph of the purport, in the advanced stage of devotional service, the devotee doesn't see any separation between his own interests and the interests of the Lord. They become one, because the devotee doesn't act for any separate interest. Whatever he does, it's just in the interest of the Lord. It's just for the Lord. At the same time, he sees everything in the Lord and the Lord in everything. So, in terms of oneness, he sees no distinction between the spiritual and material worlds. And Prabhupada explains, in perfect vision, the material world becomes the spiritual world due to its being the energy of the Lord. So it's just the one thing. The energy of the Lord. So for the perfect devotee, the energy and the energetic are non-different. So the so-called material world become spiritual. Prabhupada quotes Sarva Kal Vidam Brahma, famous verse, a sutra from the Shruti. Everything is Brahman. So he sees everything is intended for the service of the Lord, and at this stage, this devotee, advanced devotee, is expert, and he can utilize anything for the Lord. So you can't serve the Lord without being on the spiritual platform. So, therefore, Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, thus, if a so-called material thing is dovetailed in the service of the Lord, it is no longer to be considered material. Thus, the pure devotee in his perfect vision sees from all angles. Okay, let's do verse 43. The daughter of King Vidarbha accepted her husband all in all as the supreme. She gave up all sensual enjoyment and in complete renunciation followed the principles of a husband who was so advanced. Thus she remained engaged in his service. So Srila Prabhupada explains that figuratively, Malayadwaja is the spiritual master and Vaidarbhi, his wife, is the disciple. And Prabhupada refers to Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, Govastakam Sakshad Hari Tvena. One directly accepts the Guru, the spiritual master, as the Supreme Lord, not in the Mayavadi sense, but in the way here, suggested here, that since the spiritual master is the most confidential servant of the Lord, he should be treated exactly like the Lord and should never be neglected or disobeyed like an ordinary person. So that is the way that one should accept the spiritual master and understand the oneness between the spiritual master and the Lord. So then the second paragraph, Prabhupada makes the point that if a woman is fortunate enough to be the wife of a pure devotee, she can just serve him with no desire for sense gratification. And if she just remains engaged like this, she'll automatically attain spiritual perfection, the same spiritual perfection of her husband. Yes. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, if a disciple gets a bona fide spiritual master, simply by satisfying him, he can attain a similar opportunity to serve the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.